everybody, Stacey here. I am going to do your bedtime story tonight, and I think Shane and I were thinking similarly this week because tonight is going to be another Neil Gaiman, but tonight will be Neverwhere, specifically the edition that is the author's preferred text and illustrated by Chris Riddle because I love them both. Let's get started. I'm just going to show you, I'm not going to read the opening poems. Well, I guess I could. But I just want to show you some of the artwork on the opening pages. Yeah, okay. So these are the opening little poems and a statement at the front. I have never been to St. John's Wood. I dare not. I should be afraid of the innumerable night of fir trees, afraid to come upon a blood-red cup and the beating of the wings of the eagle. The Napoleon of Notting Hill, G.K. Chesterton. If ever thou gavest hosen or shoon, then every night and all, sit thou down and put them on, and Christ receive thy soul. This eye night, every night and all, fire and fleet and candlelight, and Christ receive thy soul. If ever thou gavest meat or drink, then every night and all, the fire shall never make thee shrink, and Christ receive thy soul. The like wake dirge traditional. All right. So next is the introduction to the text, which kind of explains that this was born out of a BBC miniseries, and if you want to know more about that, you can hit us up on Twitter and we will respond. So I'm going to start with the prologue. I'm not going to show you every picture, but I will show with this one since it's a full-page illustration. Pretty cool. Okay. Prologue. The night before he went to London, Richard Mayhew was not enjoying himself. He had begun the evening by enjoying himself. He had enjoyed reading the goodbye cards and receiving the hugs from several not entirely unattractive young ladies of his acquaintance. He had enjoyed the warnings about the evils and dangers of London, and the gift of the white umbrella with the map of the London Underground on it that the lads had clubbed together to buy him. He had enjoyed the first few pints of ale, but then, with each successive pint of ale, he found he was enjoying himself significantly less, until now he was sitting and shivering on the pavement outside the pub in a small Scottish town, weighing the conflicting merits of being sick and not being sick, and not enjoying himself at all. Inside the pub, Richard's friends continued to celebrate his forthcoming departure, with an enthusiasm that, to Richard's way of thinking, was beginning to border on the sinister. He sat on the pavement and held on tightly to the rolled-up umbrella and wondered whether going south to London was really a good idea. You want to keep an eye out, said a cracked old voice. They'll be moving you on before you can say Jack Robinson, or taking you in. I wouldn't be surprised. Two sharp eyes stared out from a beaky, grimy face. You all right? Yes, thank you, said Richard. He was a fresh-faced, boyish young man, with dark, slightly curly hair and large hazel eyes. He had a rumpled, just-woken-up look to him, which made him more attractive to the opposite sex than he would ever understand or believe. The grimy face softened. Here, poor thing, she said, and pushed a 50-pence piece into Richard's hand. How long you been on the streets, then? I'm not homeless, explained Richard, embarrassed. Attempting to give the old woman her coin back. Please, take your money. I'm fine. I just came out here to get some air. I go to London tomorrow, he explained. She peered down at him suspiciously, then took back her 50 pence and made it vanish beneath the layers of coats and shawls in which she was enveloped. I've been to London, she confided. I was married in London, but he was a bad lot. Me mam told me not to go marrying outside, but I was young and beautiful, although you'd never credit it today, and I followed my heart. I'm sure you did, said Richard, embarrassed. The conviction that he was about to be sick was starting, slowly, to fade. Fat lot of good it done me. I've been homeless, so I know what it's like, said the old woman. That's why I thought you was. What you going to London for? I've got a job, he told her proudly. Doing what, she said. Securities, said Richard. I was a dancer, said the old woman, and she tottered awkwardly around the pavement, humming tunelessly to herself. Then she teetered from side to side like a spinning top coming to rest, and finally she stopped, facing Richard. Hold out your hand, she told him, and I'll tell your fortune. He did as he was told. She put her old hand into his and held it tightly, and then she blinked a few times, like an owl who had swallowed a mouse that was beginning to disagree with it. You got a long way to go, she said, puzzled. London, Richard told her. Not just London, the old woman paused. Not any London I know. It started to rain, then, softly, "I'm sorry," she said. "It starts with doors." "Doors?" She nodded. The rain fell harder, pattering on the roofs and on the asphalt of the road. "I'd watch out for doors if I were you." Richard stood up, a little unsteadily. "All right," he said, a little unsure of how one ought to treat information of this nature. "I will. Thanks." The pub door was opened, and light and noise spilled out into the street. "Richard, you all right?" "Yeah, I'm fine. I'll be back in a second." The old lady was already wobbling down the street, into the pelting rain, getting wet. Richard felt he had to do something for her. He couldn't give her money, though. He hurried after her, down the narrow street, the cold rain drenching his face and hair. "Here," said Richard. He fumbled with the handle of the umbrella, trying to find the button that opened it. Then a click, and it blossomed into a huge white map of the London Underground network, each line drawn in a different color, every station marked and named. The old woman took the umbrella gratefully and smiled her thanks. "You've got a good heart," she told him. "Sometimes that's enough to see you safe wherever you go." Then she shook her head. "But mostly it's not." She clutched the umbrella tightly, as a gust of wind threatened to tug it away from her, or pull it inside out. She wrapped her arms around it, and bent almost double against the rain and the wind. Then she walked away into the rain and the night, a round white shape covered with the names of the London tube stations: Earl's Court, Marble Arch, Blackfriars, White City, Victoria, Angel, Oxford Circus. Richard found himself pondering, drunkenly, whether there really was a circus at Oxford Circus, a real circus, with clowns and beautiful women and dangerous beasts. The pub door opened once more. A blast of sound, as if the pub's volume control had just been turned up high. "Richard, you wanker. It's your bloody party, and you're missing all the fun." He walked back in the pub, the urge to be sick lost in all the oddness. "You look like a drowned rat," said someone. "You've never seen a drowned rat," said Richard. Someone else handed him a large whiskey. "Here, get that down you. That'll warm you up. You know, you won't be able to get real scotch in London." "I'm sure I will," sighed Richard. Water was dripping down his hair into his drink. They have everything in London, and he downed the scotch, and after that someone bought him another, and then the evening blurred and broke up into fragments, and afterwards he remembered only the sense he was leaving somewhere small and sensible that made sense for somewhere huge and old that didn't, and vomiting interminably into a gutter flowing with rainwater somewhere in the small hours of the morning, and a white shape marked with strange colored symbols, like a little round beetle walking away from him in the rain. The next morning, Richard got on the train to London for the 6-hour journey south that would bring him to the strange Gothic spires and arches of St. Pancras Station. His mother gave him a small walnut cake that she had made for the journey, and a thermos flask filled with tea. And Richard Mayhew went to London feeling like hell. Okay, we're on to chapter 1. I'll show you this full, creepy, illustrated page. Okay. Chapter 1. She had been running for 4 days now, a harum-scarum tumbling flight through passages and tunnels. She was hungry and exhausted and more tired than a body could stand, and each successive door was proving harder to open. After 4 days of flight, she had found a hiding place, a tiny stone burrow under the world where she would be safe, or so she prayed, and at last she slept. Mr. Croup had hired Ross at the last floating market which had been held in Westminster Abbey. "Think of him," he told Mr. Vandemar, "as a canary." "Sings?" said Mr. Vandemar. "I doubt it. I sincerely and utterly doubt it." Mr. Croup ran a hand through his lank orange hair. "No, my fine friend, I was thinking metaphorically, more along the lines of the birds they take down mines." Mr. Vandemar nodded, comprehension dawning slowly. "Yes, a canary." Mr. Ross had no other resemblance to a canary. He was huge, almost as big as Mr. Vandemar, and extremely grubby and quite hairless. And he said very little, although he had made a point of telling each of them that he liked to kill things, and he was good at it, and this amused Mr. Croup and Mr. Vandemar, much as Genghis Khan might have been amused by the swagger of a young Mongol who had recently pillaged his first village, or burnt his first yurt. He was a canary, and he never knew it. So Mr. Ross went first, in his filthy t-shirt, in his crusted blue jeans, and Croup and Vandemar walked behind him in their elegant black suits. There are 4 simple ways for the observant to tell Mr. Croup and Mr. Vandemar apart. First, Mr. Vandemar is 2.5 heads taller than Mr. Croup. Second, Mr. Croup has eyes of a faded china blue, while Mr. Vandemar's eyes are brown. Third, while Mr. Vandemar fashioned the rings he wears on his right hand out of the skulls of 4 ravens, Mr. Croup has no obvious jewelry. Fourth, Mr. Croup likes words, while Mr. Vandemar is always hungry. Also, they looked nothing at all alike. A rustle in the tunnel darkness. Mr. Vandemar's knife was in his hand, and then it was no longer in his hand, and it was quivering gently almost 30 feet away. He walked over to his knife and picked it up by the hilt. There was a grey rat impaled on the blade, its mouth opening and closing impotently as the life fled. He crushed its skull between his fingers and thumb. "Now, there's one rat that won't be telling any more tales," said Mr. Croup. He chuckled at his own joke. Mr. Vandemar did not respond. "Rat. Tails. Get it?" Mr. Vandemar pulled the rat from the blade and began to munch on it, thoughtfully, head first. Mr. Croup slapped it out of his hands. "Stop that," he said. Mr. Vandemar put his knife away, a little sullenly. "Buck up," hissed Mr. Croup, encouragingly. "There will always be another rat. Now, onward. Things to do, people to damage." 3 years in London had not changed Richard, although it had changed the way he perceived the city. Richard had originally imagined London as a grey city, even a black city, from the pictures he had seen, and was surprised to find it filled with colour. It was a city of red bricks and white stone, red buses, and large black taxis, which were often, to Richard's initial puzzlement, gold or green or maroon, bright red post boxes, and green grassy parks and cemeteries. It was a city in which the very old and the awkwardly new jostled each other, not uncomfortably, but without respect. A city of shops and offices and restaurants and homes, of parks and churches, of ignored monuments and remarkably unpalatial palaces. A city of hundreds of districts with strange names: Crouch End, Chalk Farm, Earl's Court, Marble Arch, and oddly distinct identities. A noisy, dirty, cheerful, troubled city, which fed on tourists, needed them as it despised them, in which the average speed of transportation through the city had not increased in 300 years, following 500 years of fitful road widening and unskillful compromises between the needs of traffic, whether horse-drawn or more recently motorized, and the needs of pedestrians. A city inhabited by and teeming with people of every color and manner and kind.
Could you slow down a little?
When he had first arrived, he had found London huge, odd, fundamentally incomprehensible. With only the tube map, that elegant multicolored topographical display of underground railway lines and stations, giving it any semblance of order. Gradually, he realized the tube map was a handy fiction that made life easier, but bore no resemblance to the reality of the shape of the city above. Like belonging to a political party, he thought once, proudly, and then having tried to explain the resemblance between the tube map and politics at a party to a cluster of bewildered strangers, he had decided in the future to leave political comment to others. He continued slowly, by a process of osmosis and white knowledge, which is like white noise, only more informative, to comprehend the city, a process which accelerated when he realized that the actual city of London itself was no bigger than a square mile, stretching from Aldgate in the east to Fleet Street and the law courts of the Old Bailey in the west, a tiny municipality now home to London's financial institutions, and that was where it had all begun. 2,000 years before, London had been a little Celtic village on the north shore of the Thames, and which the Romans had encountered and settled in. London had grown, slowly, until roughly 1,000 years later, it met the tiny royal city of Westminster immediately to the west. And once London Bridge had been built, London met the town of fields and woods and marshaled slowly vanishing beneath the flourishing town, and it continued to expand, encountering other little villages and hamlets as it grew, like Whitechapel and Deptford to the east, Hammersmith and Shepherd's Bush to the west, Camden and Islington in the north, Battersea and Lambeth across the Thames to the south, absorbing all of them as it grew, just as a pool of mercury encounters and incorporates smaller beads of mercury, leaving only their names behind. London grew into something huge and contradictory. It was a good place, and a fine city, but there was a price to be paid for all good places, and a price that all good places have to pay. After a while, Richard found himself taking London for granted. In time, he began to pride himself on having visited none of the sights of London except the Tower of London, when his Aunt Maud came down to the city for a weekend, and Richard found himself her reluctant escort. But Jessica changed all that. Richard found himself, on otherwise sensible weekends, accompanying her to places like the National Gallery and the Tate Gallery, where he learned that walking around museums too long hurts your feet. The great art treasures of the world all blur into each other after a while, and that it is almost beyond the human capacity for belief to accept how much museum cafeterias will brazenly charge for a slice of cake and a cup of tea. Here's your tea and your eclair, he told her. It would have cost less to buy one of those at Tintoretto's. Don't exaggerate, said Jessica cheerfully. Anyway, there aren't any Tintorettos at the Tate. I should have had that cherry cake, said Richard. Then they would have been able to afford another Van Gogh. No, said Jessica accurately. They wouldn't. Richard had met Jessica in France on a weekend break in Paris 2 years earlier. Had in fact discovered her in the Louvre when trying to find the group of his office friends who had organized the trip. Staring up at an immense sculpture, he had stepped backwards into Jessica, who was admiring an extremely large and historically important diamond. He tried to apologize to her in French, which he did not speak, and so gave up, and began to apologize in English, and then tried to attempt to apologize in French for his having to apologize in English, until he noticed that Jessica was about as English as it was possible for any one person to be, by which time she had him buy her an expensive French sandwich and some overpriced fizzy apple juice by way of apology, and, well, that was the start of it all. Really. He had never been able to convince Jessica that he wasn't the kind of person who went to art galleries after that. On weekends, they did not go to art galleries or to museums. Richard would trail behind Jessica as she went shopping, which she did, on the whole, in Knightsbridge, a short walk and even shorter taxi ride from her flat in Kensington Mews. Richard would accompany Jessica on her tours of such huge and intimidating emporia as Harrods and Harvey Nichols, department stores where Jessica was able to purchase anything from jewelry to books to the week's groceries. Richard had been awed by Jessica, who was beautiful and often quite funny, and was certainly going somewhere. And Jessica saw in Richard an enormous amount of potential, which, properly harnessed by the right woman, would have made him the perfect matrimonial accessory. If only he were a little more focused, she would murmur to herself, and so she gave him books with titles like Dress for Success and 125 Habits of Successful Men, and books on how to run a business, like a military campaign, and Richard always said thank you, and always meant to read them. In Harvey Nichols' men's fashion department, she would pick out for him the kinds of clothes she thought that he should wear, and he wore them, during the week, anyway. And a year to the day after their first encounter, she told him she thought it's time that they went shopping for an engagement ring. Why do you go out with her? Asked Gary, in corporate accounts, 18 months after that. She's terrifying. Richard shook her head. She's really sweet, once you get to know her. Gary put down the plastic troll he had picked up from Richard's desk. I'm surprised she still lets you play with these. The subject has never come up, said Richard, picking up one of the creatures from his desk. It had a shock of day-glow orange hair and a slightly baffled expression, as if it were lost. The subject had indeed come up. Jessica had, however, convinced herself that Richard's troll collection was a mark of endearing eccentricity comparable to Mr. Stockton's traveling exhibition of Mr. Stockton's collection of angels. Jessica was in the process of organizing a traveling exhibition of Mr. Stockton's angel collection, and had come to the conclusion that great men always collected something. In actuality, Richard did not really collect trolls. He had found a troll on the side of the street outside the office, and in a vague and pretty vain attempt at injecting a little personality into his working world, he had placed it on his computer monitor. The others had followed over the next few months, gifts from colleagues who had noticed that Richard had a penchant for the ugly little creatures. He had taken the gifts and positioned them strategically about his desk, beside the telephones and the framed photograph of Jessica. Today, the photograph had a yellow post-it note stuck to it. It was Friday afternoon. Richard had noticed that events were cowards. They didn't occur singly, but instead they would run into packs and leap out at him all at once. Take this particular Friday, for example. It was, as Jessica had pointed out to him at least a dozen times in the last month, the most important day of his life. Not the most important day of her life, of course. That would come one day in the future, when Richard had no doubt they would make her Prime Minister or Queen or God. But it was without question the most important day of his life. So it was unfortunate that, despite the post-it note Richard had left on his fridge door at home, and the other post-it note he had placed on the photograph of Jessica on his desk, he had forgotten about it completely and utterly. Also, there was the Wandsworth report, which was overdue and taking up most of his head. Richard checked another row of figures. Then he noticed that page 17 had vanished, and he set it up to print out once again, and another page down, and he knew that if he were only left alone to finish it, if Miracle by miracles, the phone did not ring. It rang. He thumbed the speakerphone. Hello? Richard? The managing director needs to know when he'll have the report. Richard looked at his watch. 5 minutes, Sylvia. It's almost wrapped up. I just have to attach the P&L projection. Thanks, Dick. I'll come down for it. Sylvia was, as she liked to explain, the MD's PA, and she moved in an atmosphere of crisp efficiency. He thumbed the speakerphone off. It rang again, immediately. Richard, said the speaker with Jessica's voice, it's Jessica. You haven't forgotten, have you? Forgotten? He tried to remember what he could have forgotten. He looked at Jessica's photograph for inspiration and found all the inspiration he could have needed in the shape of a yellow post-it note stuck to her forehead. Richard, pick up the telephone. And I think that is all we're going to do tonight. But once again, that was from Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere, and I hope you enjoyed that and my cat attacking me. So have a good night, everyone, and we'll be back this time tomorrow.